In this lesson, we'll learn how we can use very similar techniques to create two shadow layers to separate our ground shadow and our sign shadowing. Okay, so here's where we left off in the last lesson. You can open up 09 end. So we have our two ambient occlusion passes created, or layers. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is that we should definitely go into our render settings here, and inside of our features on our two ambient occlusion layers, we want to create a layer override and turn off our final gather. It doesn't really change the final result, but it does slow down our render by a few seconds. So right click, create a layer override, and let's turn this off. And the exact same on our ground, right click, layer override, and turn it off. Okay, so now that we have that done, we can begin working on our shadow passes. So to do this easily, let's just select our ground and our sign and right click and copy these layers. So we want to just rename them, and it looks like it only copied my sign, so I'll copy my ground next. And let's call this shadow sign. Of course, you can name these whatever you want. Shadow ground. And so now we need to come in and change their settings, because obviously they're still just ambient occlusion passes. Now there's actually a really fast way we can do this. Now remember, way at the beginning of this course, in our master layer, we used the used background material on our ground here. And what the used background does, our used background 1, is all it does is catch shadows. So what we need to do for our two shadow passes is simply assign the override of our used background shader. So let's right click these, and again I'm going to go down to overrides. Now this time we'll be using an existing override, so let me see if I can actually show this. So overrides, assign an existing material as an override, and we want to assign our used background 1 shader, which is the exact shader we used on our ground. So let's see what this looks like in our sign. So let's hit render, and actually what we should get is nothing in our alpha and in our color. That's because, well, we do not have anything casting shadows. So let's jump over to our color pass, select our light here, and right click and add it to our sign and our ground layer, because obviously we need a light to cast the shadows. So with our light added, we should be able to see inside of our alpha channel the shadows that are being casted. So if we jump over to our alpha, we can now see the shadowing that is going on. And again, because we simply copied our ambient occlusion layers, they have the correct settings for each of these pieces of geometry. So if we needed to set this up ourselves, for this we could simply remove the shadow geometry from our shadow sign. And again, in our shadow ground, we could go to our group here, and in the mental ray, make it not derived from Maya and make it invisible. But since we already copied over our ambient occlusion layers, everything's already set up for us. So all we need to do to finish off our last layer here, the shadow ground, is to right click, override, assign existing material, and assign our used background shader. And now if we hit render, we should see just the shadowing of the sign on the ground inside our alpha channel. And here it is. So we were able to reuse a lot of the work we just finished. Now there is one problem here. You'll notice our shadow is straight, but if you recall earlier in an earlier lesson, we created our curb. So this is something we have to look out for, because we do not have the curve or the curb geometry in this layer. So let's go back to our color or our master layer. Let's select our curb geometry, and let me just call this curb. And let's go to our shadow ground and add this in. So remember, it's difficult to see, but we have to make sure that the actual layers that we're rendering out match what the master layer looks like. So just to show this off, let's store this image inside of our memory and re-render the master layer. And if we take a look at our image here, we turned off our camera, so let me actually turn that back on. Or actually we can do a layer override for this. Let's go into our image plane, right click, and actually on our master layer it won't let us. So let's just place this back in so the use background shader works, so we can check our shadow. And we've run into a little issue where the Final Gather doesn't like our use background shader. So if we want to see our original shadow, we can just turn that off for a second and then re-render this region, and we should be able to see our original shadow and compare. Okay, so here's our shadow, and if we look at it compared to the alpha of our shadow layer, you can see it's obviously off. So remember, you always want to come back and check your layers and passes to make sure that they match up, because it's really easy to forget something, especially when every single object is black and pretty much invisible. So let's jump back to our shadow ground layer, and now with this added in, we should be able to render this and get the correct shadow. And here we have it. So this now matches our original shadow. Instead of it being straight, it's now pulled up onto our curb, and we just have our alpha filled in because, as we did earlier, our image plane is back in our scene, so we want to turn that back off, and finally we have our correct shadow. So in this lesson, we learned how we could copy layers we've already set up that separate our geometry, and then just use a different override or a different material override to create now two new shadow render layers. So with this done, we only have a few more layers to create. In the next lesson, let's learn how we can create a color matte layer, which will really help us later on when we get into our compositing application to separate the different objects in our scene.